and get everyone in, and we apologize. If you want to follow us on Facebook, go to Firestorm Solutions. On Twitter, at Firestorm Soul. Hashtag is Crisis Coach. And as you know, our goal is to empower you to manage risk and crises, and hopefully you won't have a crisis like we had just a few minutes ago with everything being down. Disclaimer, you need to listen to the audio portion of this and not just the slide deck. We recommend that your counsel determine applicability to your particular business, and this should not be interpreted as legal opinion or legal advice. This is the webinar today is going to be focused on natural disasters in the workplace, providing for employees in the workplace and related to that. And this is a joint presentation today between Firestorm and Nexus Preparedness Systems. And I think we're going to be in for a treat today to learn some additional information around the importance in this particular area. So as we think about supplies, we've got Jeff Hamilton. I've known Jeff for 5 years. He is Vice President and Chief Operating Officer of Nexus Preparedness Systems. And Jeff, with all these concerns today, I hope we weren't following the new report out of the earthquakes in California. We had an earthquake today. We just Bill, I'm picking up background noise out of your office at this point. So as we started into this, we did a survey of everyone who had registered for today's webinar. It's about 300 firms. And it said if your employees were sheltered in place in your facility for an extended period of time, could you provide for them? Over half of you, 58%, said yes, we can do that. 35% said no, and 7% said we have to provide for them as you look forward to it. So today I think we're going to go into a little bit more detail for that 35%, and for those of you who were in the 58, hopefully you'll learn some things today that might change some of your answers as you think about that, but more importantly, empower you to be prepared in the workplace if in fact you have to shelter in place for a period of time. What we found is that most organizations are unprepared, and we want you to become prepared to deal with this. This becomes an issue for access and time. Access, getting the access to your plans, getting your access to your supplies that you would need, and the amount of time that it takes to deal with those types of issues. And one of the things that I've learned in working with Jeff and the approach that he has done is that there are metrics and there are standards and best practices when we think about supply chain, supply logistics around being ready for these types of events. Now, most of you on the webinar are familiar with the 5 stages that we discuss when we talk about a plan and an event and a crisis and how they escalate. Pre-action is obviously before the event. You have the event. During the onset, we're concerned about life and safety. We're activating your emergency response plan. You're doing the impact assessment to determine, is this going to be a crisis? Do we need to declare that? Activating your crisis management team, and then your departmental plans for response and recovery, and then post-recovery. Supplies are needed and are critical throughout all of these sections as we think about that, and there are specific approaches to look at. And so when Jeff and I were talking about this, a bunch of questions started to come up. You know, why do plans fail? What is supply logistics? What's the process? What supplies should I get? How many of those should I get? How do I organize them? And why do I test my plans and relate to those areas? And I want to get to those questions, but I want to make an observation on the why plans fail. We've seen 5 common reasons in every disaster and crisis of failure for plans. Failure to control critical supply chains, failure to train employees, failure to identify and monitor all threats and risks, failure to test and update plans, failure to have a crisis communications plan. Supply logistics is the only failure that affects every one of those 5. So I think that's the reason why we wanted to focus on that. And the question when we look around supply logistics and you see that some of the questions that start to come up that we hope to address today is, will your next crisis have an effective response? So Jeff, when I see that, we talk about the predict, plan, perform approach that we do together at Firestorm, and in looking to this, it seems that predicting on supplies becomes quite critical. So let me throw the ball back over to you. And again, I apologize, Jeff, for the delay that we had in getting started. Talk to me a little bit about what supplies should I get?
Well, one of the most important things is to align your supplies with what your identified threats have been. If you've done a threat assessment, make sure that your supplies deal with it. It's not a one-size-fits-all. Certainly, if you're preparing for an earthquake, it's more of a major event. But if you're in the east right now, it's very cold, so you need slightly different types of supplies, and maybe for different durations. And also consider multiple threats. If you're talking about an earthquake, well, there's other things that can happen. There could be localized flooding. There could be a chemical plant next door. So consider all those threats. Secondly, really take a look at what your company's site objectives and policy are. I think the best example would be search and rescue. If the policy is that you're going to do evacuation and floor sweeps and not do formal search and rescue, then certainly don't need supplies around those things. Conversely, if you are going to do search and rescue, make sure you have the level of training to support that, and you have the appropriate supplies that match that training. You also take a look at who you're covering. What's your employee population look like? What kind of demographics are you talking about? Are there any special needs? And last, assume the worst. Many times out here in California, we reference the Loma Prieta earthquake, and that's been 20 years now, but it actually wasn't a Bay Area proper earthquake. It happened closer to Santa Cruz. And certainly some terrible things happened in the Bay Area, but should we have an earthquake, in Hayward or major metropolitan areas, it could be a lot worse. And so again, don't rely on a past event. Try to think of what can happen. Conversely, something like Sandy and what happened in New Orleans, those were worst case situations, and so I'm sure those instances where plans were maybe a little weak before in those areas, they're probably a lot more robust right now.
Obviously, in California, earthquake comes to mind, and along the Mississippi River and the fault lines there, certainly would be the case. And that new geological report that came out today showing a 49% increase in probability of a Category 8 or greater quake, a mega quake in California is quite high. I also was surprised at their forecast of a 99% probability of a 6.7 quake that would be in the next within the next 30 years. And as you look at this, it's a big phenomenon. But you talked a little bit about demographics of age, and it's not a one-size-fits-all. Children are different than adults, aren't they, Jeff?
Yeah, it's very interesting because I think a lot of time when people put together supplies, they think of infants and toddlers, for example, just scaled down as adults. And if you're a company that maybe has a daycare center or a school or whatnot, the amount of food and water they need, you'd be surprised. And more importantly, the delivery mechanism. I mean, if you're talking about having to support infants, they need to get all their hydration and caloric needs via formula. Giving an infant a food bar and water is problematic. And even the diluted formula, that gets their electrolytes out of balance, and they can actually have a seizure. So you really have to think about who you're covering. Special needs, if you're have an elder care center or a hospital, there's certainly a lot more ramifications of what you have to have on hand than with just maybe a standard employee population.
So now that leads us into how much should we get? Where do you go about thinking about that?
Well, first of all, consider how many people you're going to cover, and you really have to look at worst case situations. It may not only be just day shift. If you have 1,000 employees on day shift and 400 on second shift, well, you got to consider the crossover time. So at any one point, you could have 1,400 people at any one instance. A lot of fast-growing companies today are using a lot of contractors, and sometimes those are forgotten in the calculation of how many people to cover. I mean, I've seen 20 or 30% of an employee population be outside contractors. The other thing is to consider is duration, and certainly 24 hours is one horizon depending on the nature of the threats you're looking at. But earthquake country and things like that, your place of business can literally become a bed and breakfast because people may not be able to get home, or a certain portion of the population may not be able to get home. That kind of leads into what, looking at what conceivably can happen. And if you're trying to plan for, let's say, a 72-hour window, it may not be feasible or even realistic based on what you think may happen of covering all 1,000 people for a full 3 days. So taking a little extra time to kind of look at what may happen. And one thing you can do is look at employee commute distance and see, well, how many people live within 10 miles? Because everybody's going to try to go home. And so, you kind of put a mark out there and say, well, 10 miles is not an unreasonable amount to hike. That may give you some idea of what kind of attrition rate you may have over time. And then I talk about employee risk policy. So even if you do go through this kind of analysis and say people are going to leave, they're going to be leaving a point of refuge, and that's the company, and trying to venture home, whether they're hiking a mile or 5 miles or 10 miles. And you don't know what's out there. You don't know what they're going to run into, what the weather's going to be like. So having some type of sustenance and some means of protecting themselves with either emergency blankets or ponchos or things like that, and having some water to take along with them. You don't want to have them go from a situation of being okay to trying to make it home and being put at risk. And then even things like look at the mixture of kind of the same way. If you're a university, certainly certain students and certain staffs members may commute to the university, but you may have an inherent dorm population, and that's their home. So they're not going to leave for those 3 days. So all those things need to be taken into account in terms of how much you should get.
Well, last year in Atlanta, we had the ice storm, and children were trapped at schools, and some slept overnight in gyms, and you had parents trying to get home and locate and coordinate that. And routinely, as you look in designing your plans, asking your people how far they live from the office, which I think, Jeff, is exactly the point that you're talking about. Those that are, and you'll find now instead of miles, people are saying I'm 10 minutes away or half an hour or an hour. If you're an hour away by car, you're not walking home quickly at this point in time. And your family members you're concerned about them and where you're going to come together. So that, I can see directly that attrition that you talk about, that you might have 100% of your staff for 1 day, and then 50 or 75% the second, and then maybe only 25% the third. But a 3-day expectation in an area-wide event, like a Hurricane Sandy or a significant winter storm or the earthquake, those types of events, and look at the people that walked home in New York City after 9/11 and after the blackouts that have occurred. Transportation goes to a definite stop. Let's get a little bit more about how much should I get. Let's talk about how you divide this up, Jeff.
Well, this is really getting into a lot of the nuances, and I think the good example here is the first one. Everybody, I got to have a generator. I got to have power, and there's kind of a cool factor to having that as part of your supplies. But if you, and what you typically see is you'll see a generator and you'll see the 5-gallon gas can. But if you really look at the usage rates of that generator, a 6,000-watt generator uses about 1.8 gallons an hour. So if you've got only 5 gallons of gas, you're going to run a couple hours at best. So does that meet your objective of being able to power, provide power for maybe an 8-hour period for one night, or multiple nights? And so you really have to think about battery usage rates and fuel and things like that. The other thing in terms of metrics, and unfortunately, there are very few, if any, that are out there. Go to any emergency supply checklist, and I guarantee you that there's probably only one metric on that, and that's a gallon of water per person per day. It means a half a gallon for consumption and another half gallon for hygiene needs. That is one of the only metrics that are out there that FEMA and Red Cross provide. The rest you're kind of left up to your own guess, if you will. Because if you look at those lists, it'll say 3 days of food. Well, what's 3 days of food? So you really have to look at what somebody needs for 3 days, and kind of also going back to the talk about infants and toddlers, what they need and the format they need it. So even considering looking up and finding out what are true daily needs, considering activity factors. Certainly an employee population may be fairly sedentary during an event, but firefighters and emergency team members are going to use a lot of energy, rescuing and doing a lot of physical activity. And then the areas of the country where it's really cold, they probably need more calories per day in Buffalo, New York type of event than they would out here where we've had 70 degrees as of late. So understanding the metrics and the usage rates of what you're taking on to meet your objectives is very important. And then the next part is it's really kind of a program element of your overall emergency response program is maintaining it. The certain things, primarily food, water, batteries, light sticks, and those types of things have a 5-year shelf life. Now, if you look at maybe a typical robust set of supplies, you can figure probably 40 to 50% of those supplies have some kind of shelf life. They'll both need to be replaced in about 5 years. The other shelf life thing to consider that's often overlooked is some of the medical components in first aid and trauma kits. Ointments, analgesics, eye washes, those types of things have a 2-year shelf life. And I guarantee you, any one of you go out there and look at a first aid and trauma kit, look at the eye wash, and more often than not, it's expired because it's really not something that's kept track of. I talk about integrity checks. So where you have your supplies stored, go out and make sure they're still okay. Make sure the critters haven't gotten to them. And even the items that don't have official shelf lives associated with them, certainly a shovel you don't have to worry about, but something like an N95 mask, they don't have an official shelf life, but it doesn't hurt to go and check the integrity of the elastic. I mean, that's meant for it to be functional. So, check out your supplies and make sure they're still okay. And then, yeah.
I think you've done a good job of saying that emergency plans need to be more than just the stairwells over there. It's what do you need to, if you're going to be here for an extended period of time. And I would challenge most of the people that said yes, they're prepared for sheltering in place, to think back, have you done the type and the level of detail that you're hearing Jeff describe? I see there's a lot in terms of figuring out what and how much, but then you got to keep it someplace. There are a lot of different ways to do that, Jeff. Talk a little bit about that, if you would.
The biggest thing you need to do is think about rapid deployment. Anything that you can put in a kit form. It's easy to hand out. You want to avoid cafeteria-style situations where you're handing out food and water and light sticks and all independently. You can give something to somebody that's in a kit form and goes very quickly. Search and rescue is a prime example. If you look in there and see very nicely organized shelves of hard hats, shelves of gloves, shelves of crowbar, that means that your team has to go in there and literally shop for their supplies. If you have everything a kit, they can grab, go, and take care of business. And you want to look at things application specific. A good example would be a triage area. Having the supplies they need to do that task. Pens, triage tags, hand sanitizers, gloves, and a fanny pack is very easy to get to. You wouldn't want to give them a flashlight because they need to use their hands. So in that case, give them a headlamp. So think about things in that standpoint. distribution of where the supplies are located, especially on large campuses. You may have the bulk of the supplies in a, on the back 40 there in a container, but certain things like first aid and triage and search and rescue kits, having them strategically distributed over the campus so they can be accessed very easily is important. When you're talking about that, supply container on the back 40, think of it as a giant kit. How are you going to pull the things out to deploy? Certainly things like lighting, first aid, search and rescue are the things you'll want to get to first. Things like sanitation supplies and the food and water, when things kind of calm down a little bit, are second priority. And then even how efficiently you store those things. So traditionally putting racks on each side is one way to do it, but if you've got an aisle space in there, you've lost a third of that storage capacity. So utilizing a rolling rack as an example to fill up that center aisle. And they have the added benefit of being able to deploy functionally so that the various teams can get to them. And one other little kind of hint, if you will, you never know if you're going to have your entire team there, or the event may be a lot more intense or than you thought it was going to happen. And so you're going to have to tap into the employee population and get those untrained volunteers that have no idea, what you have. And so can you imagine a situation where you want to use those people for logistics and say, hey, can you go get all the triage supplies and set them up over there? And you kind of get the deer in the headlight look, and somebody says, what does triage mean? It'd be much easier to say, go in there, everything on the shelves with the red labels, take over to that area. It's quick, it's efficient, very easy to do. So just thinking about it in terms of a giant kit and rapid deployment is really key for how you think about your supplies and how it interrelates with how you're responding.
And that container that's in the picture to the right there could be used as an op center or a triage center for or a treatment center for your staff, so you can double task these events as you're coming together. Testing of plans. We talk a lot about tabletop exercises and simulations. Need to test the supply logistics here?
Oh, definitely. I think this is, of all the things we've talked about today, I would say this is the most important. And I've heard, the phrase used, you don't know what you're missing until you've practiced. You need to be able to train with your supplies. People need to be familiar with them, know how they work, how they function. Make sure that they understand. I mean, we've talked a lot about coverage and metrics and usage rates and things like that. Everybody needs to be aware of that, because that can help in them doing their task, and it can help the people in charge understand what their maybe limitations are. It was a worse situation than you thought. They may want to meter certain supplies out a little differently. I think the best example too is making sure after you've had an actual event or even your full functional drills, make sure you have that post-event review, the hot wash. That's where you can kind of go through and think about what worked and what didn't. I think the best example I ever saw was a company that you look, they had metrics and they had the right amount of supplies, they had high quality supplies, and everything, was textbook. And after they did an event, they kind of came to the conclusion, wow, our search and rescue didn't work too well. They had a lot of petite people on their team, and the hard hats were literally falling off, and the work gloves, they couldn't do anything. So the members of the search and rescue team that were on the petite side were taking those off and taking the gloves off, and that's not a good way to work in that situation. So their improvement was to get properly sized hard hats and gloves, and then your needs can change over time. Certainly as your company grows, different coverage scenarios, maybe new threats are coming about. Maybe you've had some new level of training. You've gotten more into search and rescue, so have the appropriate supplies that align with the training that you received so they can take advantage of that new training and any revised objectives and policies the company may have. But yeah, practice is the most important thing. because it orients people to the supplies. They know where they are. It makes it very efficient to get the job done.
I know you've talked about this as from case studies that I've seen you do and the other involvement. It's a continuous improvement cycle. You want to talk a little bit about all the things that I'm seeing on this slide?
Yeah, I think this is, again, probably a prime example of a company that really took it to the nth degree in terms of continuous improvement. Again, very good metrics, very good robust supplies, very good full functional drills and tabletops, orientation to their supplies, and over the years they've improved and improved, and still not being satisfied that they were the best they can be. They kind of looked at the last full functional drill they did. They said, it didn't go as smooth as we thought. And so they literally did an exercise. It took a full day. They had 25 members on their emergency response team. They went out to their supply cache and literally emptied it. And granted, this was fairly well organized on a priority basis before, but they pulled everything out in the parking lot. And they split the team in two. One was to look at what are the actual things that happen during a response. What do we functionally do during a response? And then the other group is the organization group, and they looked at how the supplies were organized. So about every half hour, the two groups would confer, and by the end of the event, and if Jim, you can go to the next slide, they came up with a really good visual representation of what's going on. And certainly there were situational things that, depending on the nature of the event, various triggers would get pulled. Search and rescue team would go out, or you'd set up a triage area. There were other situational things that had more of a time factor in there. So at the point they realized, hey, we're going to be here a lot longer than 12 or 24 hours. We've got some people on campus. You've got to start thinking about setting up sanitation. You've got to start thinking about getting them fed, watered, keeping them warm, those types of things. But I think the interesting thing they came to realize, there was this whole aspect that they kind of likened to opening up a store. What are the things that we do to start the process going? We need to do a head count. We need to get out our whiteboards. We need to get out our building plans, our checklists, and things like that. So there was a whole unique set of supplies that they were kind of fumbling around getting before. And so they made that as a deployable item that aligned with getting set up and getting ready for business. And from that, they also were able to determine how they would roll those racks out that I talked about and establish a perimeter so they could control their supplies and the distribution of those supplies, and really align it to the level of response and the level of training. And above all, it really came back to, there was something that everybody had a sense of ownership with. They knew how that was organized. They got more familiar with the supplies, and it just contributed to the overall efficiency of their efforts. So it's just kind of a good lesson. Says it's, when you think you're ready, continue to practice and continue to refine, because it can always get better.
Lots of information as we look at it, and I think we all are guilty of thinking about the critical decisions that are made when from a strategic standpoint in the crisis management team, or some of the tactical decisions and response decisions made at the incident management level, or even in the emergency team back in. But obviously, testing on the supply logistics and the logistics aspect, the reason we're saying logistics here is it's one thing to have it, it's another thing to get it to where it needs to be. And that goes back to the examples of what comes out first, what comes out second, how long does it last, and knowing about it. I thought your color coding idea was great. I guess we need to give a colorblindness test also to people to make sure they can see those colors as we're looking at and coming in together, because this is an integral part, and it's going to be the part that will make a big difference to their employees. As you think about these types of situations, if someone is cold, the ability to have a blanket that can cover and provide heat, the ability to recharge other items, or to handle communications and being able to work. If the power's out, how are you going to communicate with large groups of people outside of your building or in those areas? And the logistics aspect that we see all too often in big events is that you're not going to be able to get home on that first day. So you need to be aware of having those elements there. So I think, Jeff, you've done a good job of answering the questions and organizing this material. And where Jeff shared earlier that the only standard that's out there is the gallon a day of water, half for to have for consumption and the other half for hygiene. Jeff's done a great job of working with academic institutions, and in fact, he'll be coming out with a paper now that's just been done about the preparing supplies for infants and establishing those jointly in a study he's done with a major university. The insights there are extremely helpful in designing those levels. And there is an analysis system that they put in place that can show you, based upon the experience of others and the best practices that are out there, it allows you to figure out what's the right configuration and what's the right quantity that you would need. And I would encourage all of us that are in the business continuity and emergency response area, this is a critical area that we need to think about and do. So, Jeff, you had the question of, will your next crisis have an effective response? And hopefully you've answered today a lot of those questions that we can make that answer yes for all of us in coming together. And now some of the words that you had on the screen starts to support that activity, because our goal here is we have to meet everybody's expectation at that point in time. One of the other things I would remind you is that everything that we've talked about today is going to be true at home also. Having a disaster plan at home is extremely important because family trumps job. And just like you'd want to have supplies at work, you want to have supplies at home. You can download the Disaster Ready People book off the Firestorm website. Or if you'll talk to any of the Firestorm principals, they can arrange for you to get a copy of the book as it comes together. But the same level of planning, because if an employee knows that their family is okay, they can then focus on their job, and that's an important element to take place. So where do we go from here? You really want to know what's going to happen tomorrow. And we look at weather forecasts, and we think about natural events, and we look at geographical areas and times of year, and we can forecast a great many of those things. And we were talking a lot today about natural disasters, but there could be other man-made disasters that could have similar impacts that could occur. We've just seen yesterday the derailment of yet again another Amtrak train, and you could have a release chemically where you need to keep people in an area for an extended period of time. And so we're in an environment, and those of you on the call today know that we can't afford not to know. So doing the vulnerability and risk assessment, which is exactly where Jeff told us to start. What are the vulnerabilities and threats and risks that we face? That would be the beginning point of figuring out the types of supplies that we need, and then aligning those to best practices would be a key element associated with it. If you'd like to learn more about those types of things, feel free to contact us, or creating an intelligence network around that would help you manage what's being said on social media or being discussed on it, or to even get some additional training. If you'd like an assessment of your current business continuity plan or your emergency plans, or an assessment of your emergency supplies and your supply cache that you would have to have, we would be glad to do that, and we'll waive that analysis fee for you. Just reach out and contact us. So Jeff, as we're wrapping up today, and again I apologize for our loss of internet at the very beginning. It shows that I don't think we planned to schedule a disaster or crisis at the start of a webinar, but it's always exciting when one occurs. What last advice would you give the people attending today?
Well, you know, like we've talked about today, don't think of supplies separately from your emergency response plan. They really need to be aligned to the threats, and they have to be integrated effectively into your plans, and really drill down deep. You know, think about the metrics. Think about how you're going to use them. Think about how fast you want to deploy them, and make sure everybody's aware of what you have and the base assumptions for why those supplies were chosen. And it gets back to the last item, which is practice with your supplies. The more you practice and the more you do continuous improvement, the more effective you'll be. And you're literally, seconds count in this situation because, lives are at stake and property is at stake. So the more effective you can be in those situations, the better the outcome.
While it changes the outcome, and I certainly think that's a valid point, of all the things that we do, supply logistics in this point in time send a visible message to your employees or to your school, your students, that you are in control, that we thought about this, we planned for it, we have it together. And that helps us keep calm. It helps us to avoid panic and in these types of areas. So it's important that this is a critical element. And we see this as a gap in many of the plans when we sit down and talk with organizations. Today, as we did a survey leading into the webinar, a large percentage of you indicated that your firm wasn't ready to shelter employees in place for an extended period of time, or your school wasn't ready. That's going to happen. We hope it doesn't happen this year. We hope it doesn't happen next year. But statistically, we know that with over 70,000 natural disasters annually, that's the Red Cross statistic, that it's going to happen in your area and be in some direction. There could be other things that could give you pause that you need to have these elements. That's why it's important to have them done. If you've got questions, you can contact us at firestorm.com. You can go there and fill out a contact form or download the book. If you want to send us an email to ask questions, because we didn't get a chance to take questions, and I see that there are several that have come in, we are going to ask Firestorm Principal to reach out to everybody on the call today and answer your questions directly. So we'll get started on that as quickly as we can. But drop us an email and we'll get to you quickly. Or you can pick up the phone and call us at 800-321-2219. Thank you for being with us today. And next month we're going to cover cyber breach. And I believe that's an area that we're going to see more and more activation of our crisis and business continuity plans. Jeff, thanks for sharing all the information. And by the way, Jeff will be at the DRJ coming up in 2 weeks. And you have a chance to sit down and talk with him about the needs of your firms. And on that Monday night, if you're at DRJ, there's a special panel set up at 5 o'clock to talk about access and time and a series of different areas that would make a difference within your business. So I hope to see you all at the DRJ, and if we miss there, then we look forward to speaking with you next month on Firestorm Crisis Coach webinar. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day. Goodbye.